It all began on an ordinary Tuesday morning, the kind of morning where nothing seems unusual until the letter arrives in the mail. The envelope was stark white, stamped with the seal of the Homeowners Association, and immediately carried the weight of trouble. Inside was a notice that seemed almost laughable at first, a fine for installing solar panels on the roof. According to the letter, the panels were not aesthetically compatible with the community's standards. The words were written in the usual condescending tone that the HOA was known for, the kind of language designed to sound polite while dripping with authority. The fine was not small either. It was a heavy financial blow, calculated to not only punish but to intimidate. And behind the letter, everyone knew who was responsible. The HOA president, a woman who had long cemented her reputation as the neighborhood's self-proclaimed ruler. Neighbors quietly referred to her as the Karen of the block because she had a habit of nitpicking every minor detail that didn't match her vision of suburban perfection. For years, she had controlled everything from mailbox heights to lawn lengths. Now, she had decided that solar panels, clean, efficient, and practical, were somehow a violation of beauty. The irony, of course, was glaring. Many of the neighbors had outdated, cracked driveways, peeling shutters, and mold-stained fences, but none of those ever seemed to be targeted. The solar panels, however, became the enemy. At first, the temptation was to laugh it off and assume the HOA had no real grounds. After all, solar energy was not just environmentally friendly, it was also a smart investment. The panels had been installed legally, with permits approved by the city. But the HOA was not concerned with legality. Their power came from enforcing their own set of rules, rules that often seemed arbitrary but carried teeth when backed by threats of escalating fines and even legal action. The anger began to simmer. It was not just about the fine, though the number on that paper was enough to ruin anyone's week. It was about principle. Why should one person or one board dictate what a homeowner could or could not do with their own property, especially when it came to something as beneficial as renewable energy? The thought of backing down left a bitter taste. There had to be another way. As the days passed, the resentment only grew. Each time the sun hit those panels and produced clean energy, the HOA saw it as rebellion. Each watt of power generated felt like an act of defiance. The neighbors noticed too. Some were supportive, quietly whispering that they admired the stand being taken. Others remained silent, fearful of drawing the wrath of the board themselves. But even in silence, eyes lingered on the roof with something close to envy. The HOA was relentless. More letters followed, each more threatening than the last. The fines began to pile up on paper, though they remained unpaid. Words like non-compliance and escalation appeared with increasing frequency. The HOA wanted submission. They wanted control, and they were willing to push until either the panels came down or the homeowner broke. But something had shifted. Instead of breaking, the determination hardened. Rather than removing the panels, an idea began to form. One that would not only keep them in place, but take the entire situation and flip it on its head. If the HOA hated the panels for being aesthetic violations, then perhaps they hadn't considered what would happen if those panels became something much bigger than a rooftop addition. The research began quietly. Late nights were spent reading about solar expansion, battery storage, and microgrid systems. The more knowledge was gathered, the clearer the vision became. What if the system wasn't just for one house? What if it was expanded, scaled up, until it had the power to provide energy for the entire block? The HOA could complain all they wanted about appearances, but they would be powerless if the entire neighborhood was benefiting from the very thing they had tried to destroy. The plan was ambitious, bold, and perhaps a little reckless. It required money, connections, and time. But with each passing day, the drive to see it through grew stronger. The HOA had lit a fire they couldn't control. What began as an attempt to shame and punish had turned into the seed of a rebellion. Weeks passed, and progress was slow but steady. More panels were ordered, quietly delivered, and discreetly installed with the help of contractors who didn't care about HOA politics. The roof became a shimmering field of glass and metal, catching the sun's rays and converting them into quiet defiance. From the street, the sight was impossible to ignore. Neighbors began stopping by, curious about what was happening. Some admired, some whispered, and a few shook their heads nervously, already anticipating the HOA's next move. The board did not disappoint. Their fury grew in proportion to the expanding solar system. Meetings were called. Threats were made. Words like lawsuit began appearing in their letters. But still, the panels stayed. Still, the power flowed. And still, the vision grew. It was no longer about one house standing against an HOA. It was about something larger, something that could shift the balance of power in the neighborhood. If successful, it would mean the HOA couldn't simply enforce their rules without resistance. It would mean the homeowners had leverage. It would mean freedom. And as the last of the newest batch of panels was installed, the sun hit them with a brilliance that felt symbolic. The HOA thought they had won when they issued that first fine. But what they didn't realize was that they had just started a war they couldn't control. The real battle had only just begun. The shimmering panels glared like a provocation every time the sun rose over the neighborhood. What was once just an ordinary suburban roof had become a battlefield, and the HOA was determined to win. The first fine had been only the opening salvo. By the time the second month rolled around, the stack of letters had grown thick, each one angrier than the last. The HOA's language had escalated from aesthetic violation to noncompliance, and then to legal enforcement action. They weren't simply threatening anymore. They were promising to drag the battle into court. The HOA president, the self-anointed Karen of the community, was relentless. She had turned her disapproval into a crusade, patrolling the street with her clipboard clutched like a weapon, snapping photos of the house from every angle, and holding meetings where neighbors were pressured to condemn the panels. Her voice carried through the neighborhood like a siren of control, demanding conformity, demanding obedience. But there was something she hadn't anticipated. The harder she pushed, the more attention she drew to the panels. What was once a small act of environmental responsibility had transformed into a symbol of resistance. Neighbors who once remained silent began to take notice. A few even whispered words of encouragement, careful not to let the HOA hear. Others simply watched with cautious fascination, caught between fear of fines and the allure of independence. The homeowner, however, felt no such hesitation. The panels were no longer just panels. They had become a declaration. Each watt of electricity stored in the batteries represented freedom. Each sunbeam converted into power was a reminder that the HOA could be defied. And that defiance was only growing stronger. The system was quietly expanded. Extra panels were mounted not only on the roof, but on a newly installed carport, cleverly disguised as a shade structure. Battery storage units, sleek and compact, were hidden inside the garage. And with every addition, the energy capacity grew, pushing the system closer to something unprecedented. At night, while the rest of the neighborhood slept, planning continued. Research into microgrids, community power sharing, and surplus energy credits filled the hours. The city had programs that allowed homeowners to sell back excess power to the grid, and the idea of not just breaking even, but profiting was tantalizing. The HOA had no jurisdiction over utility agreements, no authority to stop energy flowing through wires and meters. That loophole would become the weapon that turned the battle. But the HOA wasn't backing down either. They doubled their efforts, holding emergency board meetings, drafting legal documents, and plastering community bulletin boards with passive-aggressive notices about neighborhood harmony. Rumors began to swirl. Some claimed the panels were dangerous. Others said they lowered property values. The lies grew louder, but so did the sun's daily reminder of who truly held the power. The tension reached a breaking point one afternoon when a certified letter arrived, stamped with legal weight. The HOA was moving forward with a lawsuit, claiming breach of covenant and demanding removal of the panels. The letter was heavy with threats, mounting fines, court appearances, attorney fees. It was designed to intimidate, to crush the spirit of resistance. Instead, it ignited a new fire. If the HOA wanted war, then war they would have. Removing the panels was never an option, not anymore. In fact, the opposite seemed inevitable. The system would grow even larger, enough to not only power one home, but to spread across the neighborhood, tying households together in a web of shared energy. The HOA could fine one person. They could threaten one roof. But what would they do when half the block was benefiting from the very thing they were trying to ban? The next phase began quietly. A few trusted neighbors were approached. They had watched the drama unfold with interest, some even cheering from behind closed curtains. When offered the chance to tap into surplus energy, lower bills, clean power, freedom from the grid, they listened. Skepticism gave way to interest, and interest became commitment. Soon, the wires that carried energy from the panels stretched discreetly to the first neighbor's home, then another, then another. What had begun as one household's rebellion had turned into a secret network of defiance. The energy flowed silently, invisible and unstoppable. Lights burned brighter in homes powered by the system. Bills dropped, and neighbors smiled quietly, even as they waved politely at Karen during her daily patrols. The HOA had no idea that their grip was slipping, that their authority was being eroded 1 kilowatt at a time. Of course, expansion could not stay hidden forever. The more homes tapped into the system, the more obvious it became. The glow of solar panels multiplied, spreading like a virus the HOA couldn't contain. Karen noticed, of course. Her clipboard filled with frantic notes. Her voice grew shriller, her letters more venomous. She ranted about uniformity, about order, about the sanctity of community rules. But her anger only made her look desperate. The more she fought, the less control she seemed to have. The battle lines were drawn. On one side stood the HOA, clinging to outdated rules and arbitrary power. On the other stood the growing network of homes quietly united by clean energy and a shared disdain for the tyranny of one woman's vision. The neighborhood was no longer hers to command. And then, the breakthrough came. The system reached critical mass. The panels and batteries combined had grown so powerful, so efficient, that the homeowner discovered something astonishing. Not only could the system power multiple homes, but it could also export enough electricity back to the grid to offset costs entirely. For the first time, the house wasn't just free from bills, it was generating revenue. The HOA could scream about aesthetics all they wanted, but they couldn't stop money from flowing. The realization was intoxicating. The panels weren't just defiance anymore. They were victory. They were leverage. They were the key to undermining the HOA at its very foundation. And yet, even as the victory seemed within reach, there was no illusion that the HOA would give up quietly. They had escalated once already. They would escalate again. Karen was not the type to admit defeat. If anything, her fury would grow louder, her tactics dirtier, her resolve sharper. The neighborhood was about to witness just how far the HOA was willing to go to keep control. The stage was set. On one side, power, literal, glowing, undeniable power. On the other, the crumbling authority of a board that refused to recognize its own irrelevance. The battle was no longer about fines or aesthetics. It was about dominance. And the next move would change everything. The letters and fines had failed. The threats had failed. Even the lawsuit, while terrifying in its wording, had stalled in bureaucratic limbo. But the HOA was not about to surrender. When one weapon failed, they reached for another, and then another, desperate to tighten their grip on a neighborhood that was slipping out of their hands. The first move came in the form of a city inspector. One bright morning, a white government-issued truck pulled into the street. A man in a reflective vest stepped out, clipboard in hand, and began walking toward the house with the solar panels. His presence drew eyes from behind curtains, and over fences. Neighbors whispered, wondering if the homeowner's rebellion had finally caught up to him. The inspector roamed the property with a practiced eye, noting every detail, snapping photos, checking permits. But everything was in order. The panels had been installed legally, with city approval, and the permits were stamped and valid. There was nothing to cite, nothing to condemn. He left with a polite nod, and the HOA's attempt had failed. But failure only fueled their determination. The very next week, a different tactic emerged. Anonymous complaints flooded the city's office, claiming everything from unsafe wiring to fire hazards. Each complaint required investigation. Each investigation wasted time, but none uncovered wrongdoing. The panels passed every inspection. The batteries were safe, the wiring up to code. If anything, the reports highlighted just how professional the system had been built. Karen grew more frantic. Her patrols became longer, her clipboard filled with scribbles, and her voice echoed louder during HOA meetings. She tried to rally the board, tried to whip up the neighborhood into outrage. Flyers appeared on doorsteps, warning about the dangers of unapproved energy systems. Rumors spread of house fires, of plummeting property values, of mysterious power surges. None of it was true, but fear had always been Karen's strongest weapon. Yet this time, fear was not enough. The neighbors had seen the benefits with their own eyes. Their bills had dropped. Their home stayed powered even when a small blackout swept through the area one evening. While the rest of the block sat in darkness, the homes connected to the solar network glowed warmly, defying the night. The HOA could call it an eyesore, but when the lights stayed on, those words rang hollow. And the rebellion was spreading. More neighbors, emboldened by the quiet victories, began asking questions. They wanted to know how to join, how to connect, how to cut themselves free from the grid. Each new participant meant another ally, another crack in the HOA's wall of authority. Soon, nearly a third of the block had tapped into the system. What had started as one roof had grown into a neighborhood-wide lifeline. This, of course, made the HOA even more desperate. Their next move was the most aggressive yet. A letter arrived, not from the HOA itself, but from a law firm. The words were sharp, heavy with legal jargon, threatening lawsuits not just against the homeowner, but against anyone connected to the illegal power-sharing operation. They called it theft, fraud, a violation of utility laws. The intent was clear, to scare the neighbors back into obedience. But fear was losing its grip. The homeowner had prepared for this. Research had uncovered the truth. Nothing being done was illegal. Energy sharing agreements existed. Selling back power to the grid was sanctioned. The HOA had no jurisdiction over utility contracts. Their threats were smoke without fire. And when the neighbors learned this, they didn't retreat, they leaned in closer. Still, the lawsuit loomed. Karen pushed hard, dragging the HOA deeper into legal battles they could barely afford. Meetings turned tense as even board members began questioning the cost of waging war over something so trivial. But Karen refused to back down. To her, this was personal. This wasn't about panels anymore. It was about control slipping through her fingers. Then came the breaking point. One summer afternoon, the neighborhood was hit with a rolling blackout. The utility company had cut power to conserve energy during peak demand. Within minutes, the street fell into silence and heat, air conditioners dead, lights out, appliances lifeless. But not every home was dark. The houses connected to the solar network glowed brilliantly, powered without interruption. Fans whirred, refrigerators hummed, lights shone. The contrast was undeniable. While half the block sat sweltering in darkness, the other half thrived, comfortable and bright. Neighbors without panels stared enviously at those with them, realizing just how much they had been missing. And for Karen, the sight was unbearable. Her own home sat in the shadows, powerless, while across the street the rebellion thrived. It was in that moment that the tide turned completely. No rumor, no letter, No lawsuit could erase the truth glowing in every lit-up window. The HOA had declared war on solar panels, but the panels had won by doing exactly what they were built to do: provide power when others had none. The blackout didn't last long, but its impact was permanent. Neighbors who had once stayed neutral now demanded to join the network. They didn't care about HOA rules anymore. They cared about comfort, savings, and independence. One by one, they crossed the line, siding with the homeowner against the board. Karen's fury was volcanic. She stormed from house to house, clipboard in hand, ranting about rules and regulations. She threatened fines, lawsuits, even evictions. But her words rang hollow. The people had seen the truth. And once people see the truth, control is nearly impossible to reclaim. The HOA board, once unified behind her, began to fracture. Some members whispered about stepping down. Others questioned whether the fight was even worth continuing. Funds were draining into legal battles, morale was low, and Karen's obsessive crusade was making them all look foolish. But Karen was not done. If anything, her desperation only made her more dangerous. She had lost the battle for the neighbors' support. She had lost the moral argument. But she still had one card left to play: escalation beyond the neighborhood. Behind closed doors, she began drafting new complaints, not just to the city, but to the county and the state. If she couldn't destroy the rebellion from within, she would call in reinforcements from outside. She would try to drag the weight of government onto the homeowner, weaponizing bureaucracy in her final attempt to crush what had grown beyond her control. The neighborhood thought the battle was winding down. They thought victory was already in hand. But they didn't know Karen like the homeowner did. She wasn't finished. She was only preparing her next move. And that move would drag the fight to a level no one had seen coming. Karen had played every card within the neighborhood: fines, threats, lawsuits, smear campaigns. None of them had broken the rebellion. So now she escalated, reaching beyond the HOA's borders. She drafted letters dripping with outrage, sent them to city officials, county regulators, even state energy commissions. She painted the solar network as a rogue operation, a reckless hazard threatening lives and infrastructure. It was a desperate gamble. Karen knew if she couldn't win locally, perhaps she could drown her opponent in layers of bureaucracy. What she didn't realize was that this tactic would backfire spectacularly. The city's energy office responded first. Inspectors were sent, again, to the property. But this time, the scope was wider. They examined not just the panels, but the shared connections, the backup batteries, the flow of energy across the block. They measured efficiency, checked compliance, reviewed permits. And when the dust settled, their conclusion was clear: everything was within code. Everything was legal. Everything was safe. In fact, the inspectors left impressed. They had rarely seen such a well-maintained private system. Where Karen saw chaos, they saw innovation. Where she saw rebellion, they saw resilience. A quiet note made its way back to the office: this neighborhood could serve as a pilot for future community energy projects. The very thing Karen tried to crush was being noticed as a model to replicate. Still, Karen did not relent. She appealed to the county, spinning her narrative of disorder. The county reviewed the city's findings and dismissed her complaints outright. Then came the state commission. Once again, they sent representatives, and once again, the result was the same: legal, safe, effective. Karen's complaints didn't just fail, they highlighted the project's success. But while officials ticked boxes and filed reports, something more powerful was brewing. The story began to spread beyond the block. A local journalist caught wind of the conflict. He wrote a feature for a small newspaper, describing the clash between a stubborn HOA and a determined homeowner who had managed to power his entire neighborhood with solar energy. The piece struck a chord. Readers shared it. Bloggers reposted it. Soon, regional news stations were calling, eager for interviews and footage. The homeowner, once silent and reserved, realized an opportunity. If Karen wanted to drag this battle into the public eye, then he would not shrink from it. He would own it. He opened his doors to cameras, let reporters walk the street, and filmed the glowing homes connected to his system. He explained how it worked, how it saved money, how it kept the lights on when the grid went down. The narrative was irresistible. A lone homeowner standing up to a tyrannical HOA, armed not with defiance alone, but with innovation and community spirit. Footage of dark homes beside brightly lit ones during the blackout became the centerpiece of every broadcast. The visuals told the story better than words ever could. Karen hated it. Every time she turned on the TV or scrolled through her phone, there it was, her defeat plastered across the region. She had tried to label the panels as an eyesore, but the cameras framed them as symbols of progress. She had called them dangerous, but experts on the news praised them as the future of energy. Her crusade was being rewritten into a cautionary tale of petty control. And the more she fought back, the worse she looked. Clips of her yelling at reporters surfaced. Photos of her angrily clutching her clipboard became memes. Online forums tore apart the HOA's actions, calling them outdated, power-hungry, laughable. What had once been a private war was now a public spectacle, and the world was laughing at Karen. But while she fumed, the neighborhood thrived. The publicity attracted attention from energy companies, nonprofits, even government programs. Offers of support poured in. Grants, subsidies, technical assistance, all aimed at strengthening what had begun as a single man's quiet project. The rebellion was now bigger than the neighborhood. It had become a movement. The neighbors embraced it fully. They held gatherings, shared updates, celebrated each milestone. More homes joined the network, panels sprouting on rooftops like a tide of independence washing over the block. What Karen once called ugly was now a badge of pride. To live under those panels was to be part of something greater than just one street. It was to be part of change. For the first time, Karen felt real isolation. The neighbors who once whispered in support of her now avoided her. The board members, weary of her obsession, stopped returning calls. Even her closest allies on the HOA grew quiet, embarrassed by the spectacle. She had lost the neighborhood. She had lost the narrative, and yet she still refused to let go. Her desperation drove her to a final, reckless choice. If officials wouldn't intervene, if lawsuits wouldn't scare people, if the media mocked her, then perhaps she could find another way to strike back. Something bold, something disruptive, something that would remind everyone that the HOA still had teeth. It began with late-night emails to private contractors, inquiries about zoning restrictions, questions about easements, about private property disputes, about security ordinances. Karen was searching for any weapon, no matter how obscure, to wield against the rebellion. Her obsession was no longer about maintaining property values or following rules. It was about her ego, her need to prove that she was right. But as Karen plotted in the shadows, the homeowner was preparing for his next move too. The news coverage had given him momentum, but momentum could fade. To secure the future, he needed more than publicity. He needed permanence. He began drafting plans to formalize the solar network into a legal cooperative, a shared energy entity recognized by the state, owned collectively by the neighbors. It would be more than just panels on rooftops. It would be a certified power provider beyond the HOA's reach. Once established, it could expand, scale, replicate. What started as defiance could transform into legacy. The paperwork was daunting, the logistics complex, but the vision was clear. The neighborhood would no longer be dependent on the grid, no longer subject to the HOA's whims. They would be self-sustaining, untouchable. And as the plans solidified, one truth became clear. Karen had miscalculated. By trying to crush a single man's idea, she had created something far larger than she ever imagined. She had ignited a movement she could never contain. Yet Karen was not finished. Not yet. In her mind, there was still one chance left, one drastic act that could shift the balance. If she couldn't beat the rebellion legally, then perhaps she would try to disrupt it physically. The stage was set for a confrontation that would push both sides beyond the limits of neighborhood drama. What had begun as a fine over aesthetics was about to explode into a battle that would test just how far Karen was willing to go, and how far the neighborhood was willing to stand united against her. Karen's world was crumbling, and everyone could see it. The once unshakable president of the HOA, the self-proclaimed guardian of community standards, was now a pariah. Her clipboard had become a symbol of mockery, her authority a punchline. Yet, rather than step back and accept defeat, she grew more dangerous. When people like Karen feel their power slipping, they don't surrender, they grasp tighter, even if it destroys everything around them. It started with whispers. Neighbors began noticing Karen creeping around at odd hours, her car parked near the solar network's control shed late at night. She no longer attended meetings with her usual composure. Her speeches had turned into rants, her words fueled by desperation rather than order. And then the sabotage began. The first incident seemed like an accident. One morning, several wires were found severed near a junction box that connected 3 homes to the solar grid. The damage was clumsy, poorly executed, but deliberate. Repair crews were able to fix it within hours, but suspicion immediately fell on Karen. Who else had the motive? Who else had voiced such open hatred for the system? The neighbors gathered, uneasy but resolute. They strengthened security around the panels and batteries, installing cameras and motion sensors. For the first time, they weren't just protecting property, they were protecting their independence. Every watt of energy flowing through those wires was a reminder of freedom, and they weren't about to let it be stolen. Karen, however, only escalated. Days later, another act of sabotage occurred. A chemical substance was poured across a set of panels, etching the surface and reducing their efficiency. Once again, repairs were made, but the message was clear. Someone was trying to cripple the network piece by piece. Each attack deepened the divide. The neighbors had had enough. A meeting was called, not by the HOA, but by the community itself. They gathered in backyards and living rooms, away from Karen's reach, and discussed their next steps. For years they had lived under the HOA's thumb, but now the tables had turned. The solar cooperative had given them unity, and with it came courage. They voted unanimously to band together, both to protect the network and to finally hold Karen accountable for her actions. Evidence mounted quickly. Surveillance footage showed a familiar figure, clipboard in hand, lurking near the panels at night. Tire tracks near the damaged junction matched Karen's vehicle. Even her emails, discovered through a disgruntled HOA board member, hinted at her intentions. Karen's obsession had left a trail, and the neighbors were ready to follow it to the end. The confrontation came one evening as the sun set, casting long shadows across the glowing neighborhood. A group of homeowners approached Karen's house, not with anger in their voices, but with quiet determination. They presented her with the evidence, photos, footage, testimonies. For the first time, Karen had no defense. Her bluster fell silent, her words catching in her throat. The clipboard trembled in her hands. But Karen was not the kind of person to admit defeat. Instead of apologizing, instead of stepping down, she lashed out. She screamed about rules, about standards, about how the neighborhood would fall into chaos without her control. Her words carried no weight anymore. To the neighbors, she sounded less like a leader and more like a desperate tyrant clinging to power. The board, tired of her antics and humiliated by the public backlash, voted to remove her as president of the HOA. The motion passed swiftly, decisively. For the first time in years, Karen no longer held authority over the neighborhood. Her reign was over. But even stripped of her title, Karen was not done. Within weeks, she filed yet another lawsuit, this time personally funded, targeting the cooperative itself. She claimed the network was illegal, that it endangered lives, that it violated her property rights by forcing her to live near it. The case was weak, built on shaky arguments. but it dragged everyone back into the courtroom once more. This time, however, the energy was different. The neighbors stood shoulder to shoulder, united against her. They pooled their resources, hired skilled legal representation, and presented their case with confidence. Experts testified to the safety and legality of the system. Journalists filled the gallery, eager to report on the latest twist in the saga. And Karen, red-faced and furious, became the spectacle yet again. The verdict was swift. The judge dismissed her claims, citing the cooperative's compliance with city and state regulations. He even scolded Karen for wasting the court's time with frivolous suits. The courtroom erupted in quiet celebration as the case closed. Karen stormed out, her clipboard clutched like a lifeline, but it was clear she had nothing left. The neighborhood had reached its breaking point, but instead of fracturing, it had grown stronger. The rebellion was no longer about a single man's panels or an HOA's overreach. It had become a symbol of resilience, of community, of what happens when ordinary people stand together against tyranny, no matter how petty or powerful. Karen's house grew quiet after that. Curtains drawn, car unmoved, the once feared woman of the block now lived in the shadows of her own defeat. The neighbors rarely saw her anymore, except for the occasional glimpse through a window. Her influence was gone, her authority stripped, her reputation ruined. But for the cooperative, the journey was far from over. With Karen out of the way, new possibilities opened. Grants and funding offers grew more serious. Energy companies reached out, curious about scaling the model. The neighborhood began discussing expansion, not just powering their own homes, but creating a blueprint that others could follow. Yet, even as the future shone brightly, there remained a lingering unease. Karen was quiet, yes, but silence can be dangerous. A woman who had fought so hard, who had humiliated herself so thoroughly, would not simply fade into the background forever. And so, while the neighbors celebrated their victory, they remained watchful. They knew Karen well enough to understand that a storm often comes after the calm. The battle for independence had been won, but the war for lasting peace was still unfolding. Because Karen, in her heart, still believed the neighborhood belonged to her. And people like Karen don't forgive. They wait. They plot. They return. For weeks, Karen's silence hung over the neighborhood like a storm cloud that refused to break. Her defeat in the courtroom had stripped her of authority. Her removal from the HOA board had taken her title, and the humiliation she endured in the public eye had tarnished her reputation beyond repair. Yet, those who knew her best understood one thing. Karen was not done. She had always been a woman of control, and control, once lost, leaves a wound that festers. The neighborhood thrived in her absence. The cooperative grew stronger, with more homes officially connected to the network. Grants were approved, partnerships were forming, and city officials even floated the idea of using the neighborhood as a pilot program for renewable energy. The rebellion, once a risky act of defiance, had transformed into a symbol of progress. Where Karen had once wielded fear, unity now reigned. But Karen's bitterness grew in the shadows. Late at night, lights glowed behind her curtains as she typed furiously on her computer, her face lit by the pale glow of the screen. She scoured forums, read obscure ordinances, and plotted ways to dismantle the cooperative. What she couldn't destroy legally, she was determined to break physically. And then, one fateful night, she made her move. It was quiet, past midnight, when Karen slipped out of her house dressed in dark clothes. She carried a bag filled with tools, wire cutters, solvents, a hammer, all chosen with the intent of crippling the solar network. Her plan was crude: disable enough connections to cause a blackout, then use the chaos as proof that the system was unstable. She crept toward the control shed, the heart of the cooperative, where wires converged and batteries hummed with stored energy. But what Karen didn't know was that the neighborhood had been expecting her. Motion-activated cameras watched every angle. Security lights stood ready to flare at the first sign of movement, and neighbors, aware of her obsession, kept a quiet vigil from their windows. The moment she raised her tools, the floodlights roared to life. The sudden blaze of illumination froze her in place. Her shadow stretched across the yard like a criminal caught mid-act. Within moments, neighbors poured out of their homes, phones recording, voices rising, not in anger, but in firm, undeniable authority. Karen panicked. She dropped her bag and tried to flee, but the evidence was undeniable. The cameras had caught everything. The tools were in plain sight, and the neighbors, once divided by her rule, now stood united against her. Someone called the police, and when the flashing lights appeared minutes later, Karen's final stand collapsed completely. The officers listened, reviewed the footage, and quietly placed Karen under arrest. She sputtered excuses, claimed she was protecting the neighborhood, but her words rang hollow. This was not leadership. This was sabotage, and it was the final straw. The arrest marked the end of Karen's reign of terror. The HOA, embarrassed and eager to distance itself, formally expelled her from the community board. Lawsuits she had filed were dropped or dismissed. Even her closest allies abandoned her. She had become exactly what she accused others of being, a blight on the neighborhood. For the community, the moment was more than just relief, it was liberation. With Karen gone, the cooperative flourished. The solar network expanded, batteries grew in capacity, and soon the block was not just self-sufficient, but capable of selling excess energy back to the grid. What had started as defiance was now profit. The neighborhood wasn't just free, it was thriving. The story didn't end there. News outlets returned, eager to capture the dramatic conclusion. Headlines celebrated the neighborhood that fought its HOA and won. Documentaries were pitched, interviews filmed, podcasts recorded. The tale of one man's fight against arbitrary rules had grown into a cultural symbol, the triumph of innovation and unity over pettiness and control. Karen's house eventually went up for sale. Few were surprised. She could no longer live among the people who had seen her downfall, nor endure the stares of those who once cowered under her authority. She left quietly, without fanfare, her departure marked only by the "for sale" sign hammered into her yard. The neighbors barely noticed. Life had moved on. In her place, a new family moved in, a young couple, enthusiastic and curious about the solar cooperative. They embraced the community, joined the network, and became part of the future Karen had tried so hard to destroy. Her legacy had not been order or power or beauty. It had been resistance, and through that resistance, progress. Years later, the neighborhood would look back on the saga as a turning point. They remembered the fines, the threats, the sabotage, but more importantly, they remembered how they stood together. They remembered the blackout that lit their homes when others went dark, the moment that showed them independence was possible. They remembered how one person's vision grew into a collective triumph. And they remembered Karen, not as the leader she once claimed to be, but as the catalyst for change. In trying to tear down progress, she had unwittingly built it. The panels still gleamed on rooftops, catching the morning sun. The batteries still hummed with quiet power, waiting to fuel another night. The cooperative stood as proof that freedom could be built, sustained, and defended, not just against the tyranny of corporations or governments, but against the small tyrannies of pettiness and pride. And in the end, the block was not just powered by solar panels. It was powered by unity, resilience, and the determination to never again bow to the rule of one. The HOA had found a man for his panels, hoping to break him. Instead, they had created a force that outlived them. And the neighborhood, once powerless, was now untouchable.